Sound arguments are great in one way. They have true conclusions, but not all sound arguments are interesting arguments. Here, for example, is a sound but uninteresting argument. Let's take a conclusion that's fairly hard to establish. Fermat's last theorem. What does it say? It says that for no a, b, c, n greater than 2 is a to the n equal to b to the n plus c to the n. Took many hundreds of years to prove this. You'd think that establishing a sound argument for this conclusion was very hard. In fact, it's easy. Here's a sound argument to the conclusion that Fermat's last theorem is true. Premise: Fermat's last theorem is true. Conclusion: Fermat's last theorem is true. The argument is valid because it's impossible that its premise be true and its conclusion false. The argument is sound because as a matter of fact, its premise is true. But of course, you're not going to, in any interesting sense, prove to anybody or persuade anybody that Fermat's last theorem is true by appealing to this argument. Likewise, it's very easy to come up with sound arguments for the existence or non-existence of God. I'm going to give you at least one, in a slightly tricky way here, because I'm not going to tell you which of two arguments is sound, but one of them is. Okay, first argument. Premise: God exists. Conclusion: God exists. Second argument. Premise: it's not the case that God exists. Conclusion: it's not the case that God exists. At least one of these arguments is sound. If God exists, it's the first argument. If God doesn't exist, it's the second argument. But neither of them is very interesting because we're not going to persuade anybody or prove to anybody who didn't know it already that God exists or doesn't exist by appealing to one of these arguments. So, good, interesting arguments have a further virtue in addition to soundness. That is, they're potentially convincing. Now this depends on where you start. Potential convincingness depends in part on who is in a position to be convinced. We'll define it like this. An argument is potentially convincing for a person when, prior to being confronted with the argument, the person believes the premises but doesn't believe the conclusion, and the person is in a position to see that the argument is valid. So, if the argument is potentially convincing for you, then because you believe the premises before being confronted with the argument, you'll be inclined to accept all of those premises. And because you're in a position to see that the argument is valid, you'll be in a position to see that, given that the premises are true, the conclusion too must be true. So you're in a position to be persuaded that the conclusion is true. So take an argument that we looked at earlier. Premise: God exists. Conclusion: God exists. This argument is not going to be potentially convincing for anybody, because there's nobody who's going to, prior to being confronted with this argument, believe the premise and not believe the conclusion. And the same can be said for other arguments that quite routinely get made for the existence or non-existence of God. So, for example, here's an argument that you hear. Premise: everything the Bible says is true. Premise 2. The Bible says that God exists. Conclusion: God exists. This may be a sound argument. If the premises are true and the conclusion is true, then it's a sound argument because it's also a valid argument. But it's not going to be potentially convincing for any realistic person. There's no person out there in the world who believes that everything that the Bible says is true, that first premise, and doesn't yet believe that God exists. You're not going to find anybody who is going to say, oh yes, gosh, look, on being confronted with this argument, I recognize that the premises are true, and as a result of that, I've come to believe that God exists. The people who believe the premises already believe the conclusion. So we're looking for an argument that's not like that, an argument that can convince people. And in particular, we're looking for an argument that can convince a special kind of person. We'll call this person the reasonable agnostic. To say that the person is an agnostic is to say that this person has yet to come to a view about whether God exists or God doesn't exist. He or she is keeping an open mind about the existence of God. To say this person is reasonable is to say that he or she shares all of our everyday beliefs about things not pertaining to God. And this person is rational in the sense that she's able to think through arguments and understand patterns of reasoning. If we can come up with a sound argument that is potentially convincing for this person, the reasonable agnostic, then we will have what we want, a proof for the existence or non-existence of God.